Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of our 45 minutes webinar series by ASI. So today's webinar is titled Promoting Responsible Source Supply Chains for Recycled Materials. So I'm Gabriel Carmona Aparicio, ASI Circularity Research Manager, and it is my pleasure to host today's discussion. This session is dedicated to ways to advance aluminum recycling through responsible sourcing by learning from key insights from the Harmonized Responsible Sourcing Framework for Recycled Plastics. So the key focus areas include meaningful stakeholder engagement, risk-based due diligence, integrating perspectives of informal waste workers and waste pickers, remediation, and capacity building. So before we start, just a few recommendations. So Sneha, please, next slide. So we will have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. So please feel free to use the Q&A box on Zoom to share any questions you have for the presenters. Another recommendation is, as this session is part of the CARE project being developed in Colombia, it's been translated into Spanish. So please click the appropriate channel to switch to Spanish if needed. It's at the bottom of the Zoom comments. There's a link to interpretation. So next slide, please. So and now, speaking of the CARE project, so let me give you a brief overview. So the CARE Collective Action for Recycling and Empowerment project aims to enhance circular economy practices by integrating informal waste pickers into formal recycling markets. So it's being developed in Colombia and is running from January 2025 to January 2026. So this project has been made possible thanks to a grant from the ICL Innovations Fund, which is supported by the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, and the UK International Development from the UK government. So the partnerships involve several partners. So if you go to next slide, please. So before we review the partners, so over the 12 next months, we'll be conducting a comprehensive overview and mapping exercise in the aluminum recycling value chain in Colombia to identify gaps and opportunities, develop and implement targeted training sessions for recycling organizations in topics such as labor formalization, safety, human rights, in order to improve standards and empower the waste workers. And we will be integrating our experiences and our processes into existing extended producer responsibility platforms that are running in Colombia for other materials such as plastics, glass, and cardboard to support efficiency, traceability, and collective action. So the idea is to align the integration of informal waste workers to align with the global responsible recycling principles. Next slide, please. Finally, so this project is a collective action. So we have different partners from the aluminum value chain. We have our local NGO, Sempre, running the activities in the field. We are also partnered with can makers such as Canpack, Crown, the Roundtable of Responsible Recycling of Metals, International Aluminium, and we have the support from ABAL, ASI's Indigenous People Advisory Forum, and Recycled Materials Association, and finally the Fair Circularity initiatives. So next slide, please. Okay, so now let's start with our presentation. So joining us today is Santwana Sneha. Sneha leads the impact work for the Responsible Sourcing Initiative at the Circulate initiative. So with over 15 years of experience in the development sector, she specializes in designing sustainable and inclusive programs, particularly in sanitation and solid waste management. At TCI, she focuses on assessing impact, strengthening knowledge and learning systems, and building capacity around the Harmonized framework. So welcome, and over to you, Sneha.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel, and thank you so much for everyone who has joined us today. On behalf of the Circulate initiative, I would like to extend thank you to all of you and to ASI for this opportunity to share more about what we do. To begin with, I would like to start by just discussing or putting things into context by sharing what are the key challenges in the recycling supply chain in general. And it's across plastics as well as other materials. If I have to highlight key three challenges, the one would be to lack of organization, which is mostly the informality of the sector, lack of transparency, again, across the value chain, and lack of adequate incentives to promote responsible sourcing practices. Now, these are some of the systemic barriers that all recycling supply chain across the world are struggling with. But who gets impacted the most through these barriers? It is the 40 million informal waste because globally, who are at the most risk situation because of these barriers. Some of the challenges that we all know are stigmatization and marginalization of the informal waste because their lack of access to social and financial security services, health and safety impacts, lack of adequate and safe working conditions, amongst many others. What we try to do through our initiative is to mobilize stakeholders across all the value chain to ensure that the plastics waste supply chain not only support recycled plastics, but also safeguard human rights. So the responsible sourcing initiative is an effort to answer the how for companies who intend to improve human rights across their value chain by taking some measurable actions. The initiative is implemented across 5 different countries across the globe, including India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Kenya, and Ethiopia. It has 5 core work streams, and today we are going to spend more time on the work stream 1, which is harmonizing definitions and frameworks for responsible sourcing. Briefly, the other work streams include implementing traceability tools for the full value chain transparency, implementation projects where we intend to improve the human rights and working conditions across the value chain. The 4th work stream is about building capacities and training all stakeholders. And lastly, the work stream for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, where we intend to share and disseminate whatever we find for scaling up responsible sourcing practices. As I said, for today's session, we are going to dive deep into the harmonized responsible sourcing framework, as Gabriel mentioned. Before we dive into that, it's important to mention that the program and the initiative takes a full value chain approach, which is beginning to involve brands and companies as well as recycling partners to the informal waste sector workers. Now, what's important here for all of us is that the last years, what we see here, which includes small businesses, junk shops, small aggregators, and the informal waste sector workers, they handle most material types which can be recycled. So at this level, when we talk about improving human rights practices, it's basically material agnostic. And improving practices at these layers or these tiers can impact the value chain systematically. With that, the purpose that we are here today is to try and see whatever we have learned from the Harmonized Responsible Sourcing Framework and its implementation, how can those insights support the advancing of responsible sourcing practices in the aluminum recycling space with all of you. We would first get into the overview of the harmonized framework and how we developed it. And to set the context, the framework was published in May 2004 last year, and it was the first ever global effort to establish a harmonized and actionable framework for plastics recycling sector. The development of the framework was built on the international core human rights principles involving UNGPs, United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and the Fair Circularity Principles. Fair Circularity Principles are again the result of a collective action project of brands under the Fair Circularity initiatives. So these 2 guidelines were the foundational building blocks of the harmonized framework, which then took into account existing other frameworks by brands, frameworks from other sectors, and the best practices for human rights, which ultimately led to the harmonized framework for responsibly sourced recycled plastics. This process was led by Shift. Shift is a leading authority on global human rights space already, and they are the developer of UNGPs as well. It took almost a year for us to go through a very intensive participatory and consultative process, and we spoke with over 40 organizations engaging with recyclers, brands, aggregators, and most importantly, the waste worker organizations, such as International Alliance of Waste Pickers and Viego, to ensure that the waste worker voices are represented very strongly in the harmonized framework. The publication had very clearly defined themes, definitions, and minimum and advanced indicators, which we'll talk more about the indicators shortly. So that was briefly the process of what we took to develop the framework together with Shift. Now, what do we mean by responsible sourcing? So in the framework, what we have defined as responsible sourcing means that all participants in the recycle value chain, and it's good to mention here that this definition is also applicable in other sectors because it talks about shared responsibility to respect human rights, not only in their own operations, but most importantly, throughout the value chain, including the informal waste workers and waste pickers. And stakeholders recognize informal waste sector as key part of their value chain. And lastly, they take actions across all tiers of the recycle value chain, which is about remediation and improving human rights practices. With this overview, we'll now talk about what are these themes and indicators, and we'll look through some examples. In the interest of time, the indicators are quite extensive, but I'll talk about some key examples of indicators across all these themes, and I'll encourage you to read and go through the indicators in detail, which is already available at our website. So the framework has 5 key themes, and these themes were a result of the consultative approach that I mentioned, and these were as a result of inputs provided by all stakeholders who engaged with us through working groups and individual consultation. The 5 key themes are economic empowerment, health and safety, autonomy and inclusion, collective representation, and lastly, gender equality. We'll talk about each of these themes in the following slides. But before that, each of these themes, as I mentioned, has well-defined indicators. Now, the purpose of these indicators are to have very clearly defined goals, which can support companies and stakeholders in assessing, tracking, and measuring progress. These indicators are grouped into 2 categories. One is minimum and the second is advanced. And these are also applicable for the entire value chain, which I mentioned earlier, including the formal and informal waste workers, as well as waste pickers across the plastic value chain. Waste workers' voices are at the heart of these indicators to ensure that their human rights practices are safeguarded. The 2 types of indicators we have, the purpose of this was to have a floor of what we can achieve and a ceiling. So minimum indicators, while they are a floor or what good should look like as a minimum, the advanced indicators are the ceilings, which are more about systemic improvement and may take a longer time frame to achieve. With this overview, now I'll deep dive into the economic empowerment theme, which is our first theme. This theme aims to ensure that all waste workers, including waste pickers, have the right to a decent standard of living. Now, when we talk about decent standard of living, what it means that workers are able to afford, not only for themselves, but their families, decent food and nutrition, clothing, housing, medical care, and other basic needs. So it's basically ensuring the concept of living income and living wages are met. It talks about access of social and financial services, which is like access of bank accounts, access of loan services, access to cooperatives. And it also has one key topic of child labor, because we know that the reason that children are working as waste pickers or in waste picking because of economic insecurity or lack of resources. So this is what the theme represents. This is also the theme that we have the most of the indicators. So we have around 20 odd indicators in this theme, but I'll talk about 2 examples of the indicators that we have here. So one of the minimum indicators under this theme talks about achieving minimum wages. And it is about employed workers receive minimum wages as per the local wage standards, which is a must, which should be a must. Now, an advanced indicators in the same theme talks about employed workers are paid the living wage for their location. Now, why is it an Advanced indicators, because achieving living wage will need some time, will need capacity building, and will need a lot of other partnerships with government as well as other NGO partners to ensure that living wages could be achieved for the workers. Another example in this theme is about age verification system. So I talked about child labor being a critical component of the economic empowerment theme. So one of the minimum indicators addresses that by having a system in place and enforced for age verification, while an advanced indicators talk about having effective processes in place to follow up on children which are removed from waste picking and they are integrated either into schooling or they are improved from their current situation. Now, this indicator is also a reflection of what we talk about business ethics and business processes by ensuring that businesses have a system in place to not have anybody employed as a children into waste picking or any waste work. Now, the second theme is about health and safety. And as the name explains, it's about creating and ensuring a safe and healthy working environment where risks are identified and reduced in order to prevent accident, illnesses, or injuries. Again, if you look at a definition in this theme, it also talks about or highlights the need of setting business processes which can start tracking injuries and also have remediation action to address injuries whenever they arise. So it mentions about awareness on health and safety, like providing trainings, ensuring workplace safety protocols and measures at workplaces, and trying to minimize workplace risks by planning well in advance. One example of the minimum indicator under health and safety is about access of PPE equipments for all waste pickers. Whereas an advanced indicator talks about all workers and waste pickers use appropriate personal protective equipment. Now, I talked about having a floor and a ceiling and the difference between minimum and advanced indicator. And that's a great example to see here is that when we talk about access, it does not ensure that PPE is used as well. And we have seen through our own assessment projects that sometimes the challenge is accessing PPE, but often, despite of access, waste workers are not comfortable using PPE and they perceive that it impacts their work efficiency. We heard from a lot of programs on the ground that workers expect comfortable PPE. So what could be done to have PPE designed in a manner that waste workers and waste pickers can effectively use the PPE? And that's why the journey from a minimum to advanced indicator, from access to use. Now, another example under this indicator is about training. So one of the minimum indicators talk about all workers and waste pickers are trained on safe working practices, including fire and hazardous material safety, natural hazards and disasters, and any foreseeable emergencies. While the advanced indicator talks about all workers having access to healthcare systems. So these were two examples on health and safety. That's our second largest theme, which has a lot of indicators, and other indicators talk about setting workplace policies and protocols to track injuries and to address injuries as well. Now, on to the third theme of autonomy and inclusion. As the name also explains, this theme is about having equal treatment and a dignity for waste workers and waste pickers without any discrimination and without any restrictions on the freedom of a worker. So the concepts of forced labor, concepts of autonomy, and including waste workers' voices in decision making, these are the key elements of the third theme that we have. Again, an example of the minimum indicators talk about all workers are recognized and have access to identification cards, and they retain possession of their original identification paperwork. Now, access to ID cards sometimes feel like a basic human rights, but what we have seen in many geographies that we work, because of migration, because of lack of awareness, it's difficult for sometimes waste workers to have ID cards. In some cases, they might also be asked to deposit their ID cards to get into employment or work. So that's where this minimum indicator targets and focuses on. Now, one of the advanced indicators are that interventions are in place to protect and assist victims of forced labor. So in case there is any identification or case about any forced labor in the supply chain, this indicator means to have measures in place to support and assist those workers through different means. Now we are on the fourth theme, which is about collective representation. Again, this theme talks about the access of union and cooperatives, which is basically to organize themselves and to be able to bargain collectively. So collective bargaining rights and access of grievance systems are a key element of this fourth theme. Example of one of the minimum indicators under collective representation is that all workers are aware of and can freely exercise their right to form or join a union or to seek representation and to be able to bargain collectively. And they are able to do so without any fear of intimidation or harassment. So that should be a minimum that they are aware about such opportunities. While the advanced indicators focuses on having access and opportunity to belong to such unions or organization. So similarly, we see that the journey from minimum to advanced begins from aware to having an access and opportunity, which might take some time. The other examples are about grievance system that I mentioned. So one of the minimum indicators focuses on mechanisms in place for employed workers to report an issue or complaint at work. Again, through our experience, what we have learned is while there are a lot of informal mechanisms in place for workers to maybe share a complaint, largely many actors lack formal systems in place for grievance management. So this is what this minimum indicator refers to. Now, one of the advanced indicators focuses on that whenever these grievances are filed, they are monitored, they're addressed and reported. So it's basically having a system and then tracking that system effectively and making it to use. The last theme is about gender equality. And as we know that gender equality is one of the basic human rights that we know, but we also know that women waste workers and waste pickers are often at greater risk because of the nature of the work. The risks to health and safety is also much larger than men. So that's where this indicator is focusing on, that we can ensure equal participation of both men and women waste workers, and they are represented equally. They have the equal opportunity to sell and work in the waste sector. So gender inclusive interventions and respect and safety without any gender bias, these are the key elements of the last theme that we have. Example of one of the minimum indicators is about workplace hiring policies allow gender equal hiring practices, and they stop or prohibit gender-based discrimination or any forms of harassment. Similarly, an advanced indicator talks about that processes are in place to protect and assist reported victims of gender-based discrimination and harassment. So here again, we see that it talks about business processes in place, which can improve transparent tracking, which can encourage people to come up and report, and also addressing such risks whenever they arise. These are the 5 themes and example of these indicators that I just shared. The document that we have on our website has detailed list of indicators, and I would again request you to read it whenever you have time for just getting into more details. The last section of today's webinar is about how do we implement the harmonized framework. And implementation for us is with a systemic approach. How we have looked at implementation is in a phased manner. And it begins with engagement, and it's basically meaningful stakeholder engagement, followed by assessment, remediation, building capacity, monitor, evaluate, and reporting. What we acknowledge is that all of this takes time, and all of this needs to be a progressive improvement approach. And that's why stakeholders are guided in this document to begin with a very meaningful stakeholder engagement, to monitoring, evaluation, and reporting, while ensuring there is adequate transparency across all the phases that we mentioned. these phases also have designed or specific tools to implement. At the moment on our website, you will find tools for stakeholder engagement and assessment, which is basically due diligence, how to do risk-based due diligence, how to conduct root cause analysis, and how do you provide feedback to the participants of the assessment and build trust and rapport with them. This follows by remediation, which is about remediation action of the needs that are identified during the assessment and previous phase, building capacity on these critical topics, not only for internal stakeholders, but also of the external stakeholders and value chain actors, including workers' learning program. And lastly, how do we continuously monitor and report against these indicators? So this is in a nutshell about the implementation approach that we have. Again, some of these tools are already on our website, and we'll be publishing the remaining sets of tools for the phases by June or by July or August this year. So that's something that we are working on at the moment. With that, I think I was able to keep it to 25 minutes, Gabriel, and I'll pass it on to you for any question or answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sneha, for this insightful presentation indeed. Yes, I'm going to invite our participants if they would like to post any questions, so please use the Q&A box. I'm going to start with some questions that we received before the seminar, the webinar, sorry. One of the questions that we received was, how does the Harmonized framework relate with respect to international human rights standards and guidelines?
Sure, thanks, Gabriel. So when I was sharing the process of how we arrived at the framework, I talked about UNGPs. So it has the United Nations Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights at the core of it, and also the Fair Circularity Principles, which focuses on informal sector representation in the recycling space. So that's one part. We also have looked into ILO standards and other common standards which promote human rights in the informal sector. So that's the part which we included in the framework development itself. During the consultation as well, when Shift was developing this process for us, because they are one of the key authorities on global human rights practices, it helped us in ensuring that we are not leaving out on any existing guidelines relevant to us.
Excellent, thank you. Another question that we have here is, how can the Harmonized framework help other sectors and recycling supply chains?
Right. So when I was talking about the full value chain approach, the informal waste pickers are picking all materials that they get, right? All types of recyclables, including plastics, paper, glass, and metal, including aluminium. So in that sense, when we talk about improving human rights practices and tracking them, any improvement at that level will be material agnostic, right? So when we talk about those tier 3 aggregators, small aggregators, junk shops, informal waste pickers, they automatically get covered through such responsible sourcing practices. And any improvements will address any material type at that level. When we look at the top tier of working with large aggregators or recycling companies, that's where processes are more into material specific types. So one could be aluminum recycler or plastic recycler. But when they take this full value chain approach, they will impact even businesses who are handling other material types. And these indicators that I just shared, they actually reflect human rights practices and not necessarily a material type. So in that sense, we feel that the Harmonized framework is a useful document even for other sectors to try and track the human rights practices.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just going to add a bit more for the questions that is posted at the moment. So it can be used for the aluminum sector. The question is, it can be used as it is, or is there a need for an adjustment just for aluminum?
Well, in terms of, so again, I'm going by the example that I just shared, right? For example, setting up age verification mechanism or having training systems in place for waste workers. All of that can be used as it is. So at the moment, we talk about what waste workers and waste pickers should have, and what kind of policies and practices businesses needs to have. And in that sense, it does not mention that only plastics. So a large number of indicators can be used as it is.
Excellent, thank you. And you were also talking about the level of the engagement that companies have with different actors in the supply chain. So we got another question, which is, they say our tier one suppliers are primarily traders. So is the framework applicable to them as well?
So the tier one suppliers, even if they deal in specific material types, I'm again going by what I mentioned earlier, that informal waste workers are the heart of it. So what this framework helps in adding this component of a full value chain approach. So even tier one aggregators, what kind of engagement or assessment they can do with help of this framework, involving even the last tier. So in that sense, it's useful for them, and they can take some learnings from how do we engage with waste pickers, how do we map the entire supply chain. So some of the tools that we have of stakeholder mapping or value chain mapping is very useful for even those aggregators. Similarly, the assessment questions or assessment tools that we have, that's also very useful for any aggregator in aluminium sector or other sector to begin that risk-based due diligence process involving the last year. So I'll be also interested in hearing any feedback once such aggregators go through our tools and see how they find it useful or not.
Excellent. Yes, and your email is on the screen. So if you have any feedback that you would like to provide directly to Sneha, so email her directly. So one question from Vikas is, who is the most responsible in the supply chain in promoting the guidelines? So, and how can the players work together to make a successful sourcing practice across the value chain?
That's a great question. Thank you. So, well, the framework mentions a shared accountability and shared responsibility. So we don't say that one actor bears a larger responsibility, but if we take a top-down approach, setting up processes begins at brand level or a large recycler level. And that just supports the further actors in the value chain, like smaller aggregators, to set up better practices. So while it's a shared responsibility, sometimes a top-down approach can help, while adequate capacity building measures for everybody in the value chain are complementing that. So we also look at capacity building throughout these phases. So we talk about stakeholder engagement, building capacity of recycling companies or even aggregators in that phase. Then when we talk about assessment, again, capacity building of everyone, what does it mean? How should you conduct a risk-based due diligence? How do you build relationship and rapport? So that's a key part. And again, these are some of the themes that happens across the implementation, right? So I would say a shared responsibility, but beginning by setting up better systems and practices in place by bigger businesses can support a faster uptake of responsible sourcing.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have another question from Kunapong. Please, could you share some of the stories or insights you saw firsthand from the ground, how the harmonized framework being implemented or receptive by the value chain players? Are they open to adopting the framework? If not, what are the common challenges or hesitations?
Thanks. We are currently implementing the responsible sourcing initiative in 5 countries, as I mentioned. In some countries, we are already past the stage of assessment and we are currently going towards implementation. The first phase where the harmonized framework is put into practice is stakeholder engagement and assessment. And assessment is done as per the harmonized framework themes and indicators. So when we do field assessment, we evaluate each and every indicator. So that's the first step where we put the framework into practice. Then when we develop remediation action plan, that's about identifying high risk areas and priorities together with our implementation partners, and then design what should be the solution. So an example is when I talked about access of ID cards, we found that in Indonesia, ID cards is a big challenge for waste workers, right? And the challenge leads to further exclusion from a lot of social and financial benefits that they can otherwise access. So the solution now focuses on how do you build capacity, how do you create awareness, and how do you bring parties together so that waste workers can have access to ID cards. Once they have it, then it can lead to, with help of capacity building, improved income, better healthcare benefits, better education, which is again connecting back to economic empowerment theme. So that's one example. We do have a lot of positive feedback from wherever we are implementing the program. No hesitation as such, but they do, of course, find it very ambitious, and it is ambitious, and that's why we have minimum and advanced set of indicators to implement the framework. But our partners are also very optimistic, and they like the framework as a guiding document that when we talk about responsible sourcing without clearly defined themes and indicators, it's how do you measure that? So in that sense, the feedback that we have received so far is very encouraging. It's a roadmap for our partners to be able to implement, assess, and track very well-defined goals under the program.
Excellent, thank you. Just I'm thinking about that you said have been implemented the project in the framework in different countries, and we got a question before, which is about please you could cover different approaches based on the availability of infrastructure and the impacts on waste pickers. So if there's a difference between the countries in terms of infrastructure and how that affects or impacts the implementation of the framework.
Thank you. That's actually a key part. And I talked about lack of organization or organizing waste because as a challenge, which is about informality of the sector. So what we see is where waste workers are organized better, there a lot of minimum indicators we see are met. So examples from Brazil that we hear is that a lot of cooperatives have already integrated waste workers, and there are waste worker cooperatives which have led to better health and economic empowerment for the sector and for the workers in general. Similarly, in India, what we see, there are excellent examples of waste worker unions and cooperatives, which have, again, improved lives of thousands of waste workers. So that's definitely more helpful when the informal sector is organized. Where it's not organized, there it's more challenging. For example, countries like Vietnam or Indonesia, it's in the early stages. Well, while there are unions and cooperatives, they are not as large, and their collective representation needs to be strengthened. So that's one challenge that we see in different geographies, which impacts the implementation of the framework, because remediation action or the initial focus goes into maybe more organizing, giving them identification cards and such things. And it could be easier where they're already organized.
Thank you very much. Okay, probably the follow-up questions is a top-down due diligence approaches rely on traceability, and in my experience, waste collectors and aggregators are often ignored or overlooked in this process, with brands and manufacturers saying they don't know the ultimate source of their materials. Does the framework help support traceability and sharing of source data, and if so, how?
Yeah, great question again. So traceability and transparency, when I was talking about work streams of responsible sourcing implementation, that's one of our core work streams as well. And it also is reflected in the harmonized framework themes and indicators. So a lot of themes, or a lot of indicators rather, are around business practices and improving transparency through these business or through better practices. But in the implementation projects, what we aim to do, we are also trying to pilot traceability tools and selected traceability tools in our programs, which can not only track material rights, but also track the harmonized framework indicators. And that's something that's currently work in progress. Through these pilots and models, we aim to establish evidence that both material and social compliance can be tracked, and it can help brands and companies to ensure that this is where the material is coming from. Having said that, we acknowledge that it's challenging. It takes time because to go from large aggregators to onboard them to waste pickers, it involves a lot of capacity building, a lot of training and awareness on how do you use such tools, how do you register waste workers on those tools, register junk shops on those tools, and needs also a lot of trust and rapport building. So that's what we are learning at the moment. And we hope to be able to bring all these value chain on this traceability platform to demonstrate that it's possible to do that.
Excellent. So, probably a follow-up from a question we got during the registration process is like how these digital tools, if they're going to be part of the framework, can help like navigate the global challenge of the supply chain. So, are those tools that, for example, help trace the material beyond the scope of the location where the material is collected, or is going to be limited by that geographical scope?
That's so when we talk about identifying the source or chain of custody, then it has to be limited to that geography, right? Because then chain of custody needs to involve where the material came from. But in terms of some of the social compliance indicators, that could be applicable, of course, in any business practices. So that are very generic harmonized framework indicators, if we can refer to. So it talks about what kind of business documentations are in place. What is the current verification system for age, for example, or do they use PPE kit or not? So some of these indicators will be location specific because you need to tie them to a facility or a source when we talk about traceability. But some of the indicators when we talk about just compliance could also be like just business practices, and anywhere and any sector could pick that up.
Excellent, thank you. Another question from Johnny. Probably if you can share, if possible, share names of any well-known material suppliers, whether it's plastic or aluminum, adopted the initiative for marketing their materials.
So we are currently, I'll give an example of India where we are working with the Coca-Cola company and a recycling company called Sri Chakra Polyplus. So the approach that we take, and we didn't have time, so I didn't got into that, but good to mention here that while implementation projects, we ensure that the project has one brand partner, one recycling partner, and then all selected actors till the informal waste pickers in their value chain for implementation. So in that sense, each of these implementation projects has key actors engaged. So I gave example of India where we are working with one of the largest recyclers to improve responsible sourcing in their selected value chain. But these are pilot projects and these are beginning with selected actors in the value chain. And with help of capacity building, which is again another work stream for us, we help to amplify and scale such practices over a due course of time.
Excellent. I'm going to adapt this question because part of the question have been answered before, but what about local governments? So what role could they play?
They do need to play a big role because it's about systems improvement, and systems improvement cannot happen with just private sector and civil society organizations. So in that sense, government bodies play a key role. We work with governments through our partners in these implementation geographies, where the partners together in a collective action manner can help in improving, let's say, policies or influencing policies. As such, we directly have not worked with government so far, but because everything is about systemic changes over time, we do engage wherever possible through our network partners for policy advocacy.
Okay. Excellent. Just one last question. I believe you have had the chance at least to skim read the ASI's standards and guidelines. So how do you see our standards being linked to the harmonized framework?
Sure. Well, and that's a good last question for us to wrap up. So when I went through the ASI standards and definition of responsible sourcing, how you have or how ASI has referred to, it's very similar to what we call, right? It talks about setting up procurement policies by businesses, which then encourages better practices. That's something very similar to how we are saying responsible sourcing in our framework. But what we are putting more focus on is representation of informal sector. So I think that's one of the highlights of our framework, which can maybe support the ASI standards as well, that how do you strengthen that voice? The standards are pretty extensive and very comprehensive. The ASI standards, I mean, including environmental and governance indicators. Every theme and standards that we have, we also found them to be in your network in different manner, of course, because the way that we have structured is different. But I also found the health and safety indicators there. The only area where I think could be more, we could work together or maybe could be enhanced further is just bringing the informal sector voices into the framework
Excellent.
or the
Wow.
standards.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to extend a huge thank you to Sneha for her enlightening presentation, and to all of you for participating and engaging with us through your questions and comments. So I also want to remind everyone that a recording of this webinar will be available. So please watch out for an email with the link, or check out our website. This can be a great resource for those who wish to revisit today's content or share with colleagues. So lastly, keep an eye on our upcoming webinars and events, visiting our website, subscribing to our newsletters. So we have many topics and experts that line up for our Q&A, our webinars. And thank you once again for joining us today. We hope you find this session informative and inspiring, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. So have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.